Concept 54.3 is all about change and disturbance of these biological communities. It says that disturbance influences species diversity and composition, and there is some competing hypothesis within ecology that have really kind of transformed over the last few years or the last few decades. Decades ago, most ecologists kind of favored this equilibrium view. They felt like mature ecosystems would reach what we would call an equilibrium where there would be very little change. You have these climax superorganisms sort of at the top of the heap, and you form what's called a climax community, which gets everything all sorted out, reaches an equilibrium, and then remains very static for fairly long periods of time. Now that view is pretty much challenged by this idea that communities are never truly at equilibrium, that they are always at this non-equilibrium model, which describes communities as constantly changing, at least in small amounts, after being buffeted by different disturbances. Some of these disturbances may be large, like forest fires or earthquakes. Some of them are small, like weather changes, seasonal changes, and the like. So a disturbance is any event that changes a community, removes organisms from it, or adds new organisms, alters resource availability, things like that. Most ecologists now tend to favor this non-equilibrium model where there are always small disturbances going on and there is always this change, this fluid motion of these communities where they're never really stable. They never really reach what we used to always think of as a climax community that was fairly static over time. Of course, when we talk about disturbances, they can vary in intensity. We could be talking about something that wipes out a whole number of species and does a lot of damage to the ecosystem, or we could be talking about lesser disturbances, like I said, seasonal changes or changes in availability of resources that are on a smaller level. Fire would be a good example of a significant disturbance in most terrestrial ecosystems, and a high level of disturbance is a result of high intensity and high frequency. If you had a number of forest fires in, say, 3 years in a row, that would be a major disturbance to an area, as opposed to maybe some slight weather changes in one particular season. So these disturbances can be great or small, and the size of that disturbance is going to kind of have a different outcome for that community. There's another hypothesis that is pretty favorable in ecology that says that intermediate disturbances are actually beneficial. So intermediate disturbances can foster greater diversity than either high or low levels of disturbance, and this is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. High levels of disturbance, of course, tend to do a lot of damage and exclude many slow-growing species. So forest fires, particularly if you have forest fires a number of years in a row, that's a high level of disturbance, and that's going to wipe out a lot of the slower growing species or the ones that can't adapt fast enough to that change. Low levels of disturbance tend to allow for the dominant species to overrun everyone else, and they tend to outcompete everyone else. So what you end up with is less diversity at the high level of disturbance or the low level of disturbance, and you actually tend to end up with the greatest diversity at this intermediate disturbance, to where you have occasional medium-sized disturbances that kind of keep everyone off their game. It's kind of like if you have things that occur where no one has the upper hand and they're all fairly on a level playing field. That's when you're going to have the greatest amount of diversity. An example your textbook uses is in New Zealand. There was a study studying the richness of invertebrate taxa. Invertebrates are all these little creatures, say, that live in ponds and streams without a backbone. So insects and these little shrimp-like creatures and all those types of crustaceans and the like. They found that the richness of the invertebrate taxa was highest in streams with an intermediate intensity of flooding. So where there were streams with no flooding, you tended to have dominant species that ruled the community. In species that had flooding often, you tended to have lower levels of diversity because only a few creatures could make it under those conditions. But in intermediate levels of disturbance, that's where you had the greatest diversity. Here's an example in the textbook showing the chart that they found. So here's an index of disturbance intensity. This basically tells you how often and how severe the disturbances were, moving from small to the left to larger to the right. And here's the number of groups, the number of taxa within that. And so what you found was the largest diversity tended to be clustered in areas that had this medium intensity of disturbance. We can also look at examples of large-scale disturbance. A great example from right here in North America, not too long ago, this would have been perhaps a long time ago for you guys, but not that long ago for me, was back in 1988. In Yellowstone National Park, there was a large-scale fire that damaged a huge swath of the national park, and it demonstrates how communities can often respond pretty rapidly to this massive disturbance. So there's a map, you can find a larger map on the internet. This was the area burned as of September 15th, 1988, and all of this yellow that you see is the burned area of Yellowstone National Park. It was a huge percentage of the park that caught fire and burned to a great degree. So this Yellowstone forest and its ability to bounce back is an example of a non-equilibrium community where things are in flux and things are changing. This is what a portion of the state park, or the national park, looked like soon after the fire. Lots of species wiped out, lots of land damaged, but remarkably within just a few years things began to change. This is a similar area only 1 year after the fire. And 1988 wasn't that long ago considering the damage of the fires, but if you were to go there now, you would be hard-pressed to find evidence of that fire. Now what you might see is that some of the old, long-standing, older trees, there's less of them and that type of thing, but you wouldn't be able to just say, oh yeah, there was a fire here and I can tell, because there has been a great revival of the life there at the Yellowstone Park, even after such a large disruption such as this. When we have changes in an ecosystem, we end up with what we call ecological succession. Certainly something you've studied. I know this is studied in middle school, and you probably studied it in freshman biology as well. Ecological succession is the sequence of community and ecosystem changes that occur after a disturbance. We have primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is basically starting from nothing. If you think about the islands of Hawaii that were formed from volcanoes that grew from the ocean floor, well, when that land first formed, when those volcanoes first erupted and formed those islands, there was nothing but bare rock. There was no creature living there. There was no soil. It was just bare volcanic rock. And once it cooled, things started to happen. That's primary succession. After a volcanic eruption, after a massive flood or something that wipes everything away, after glaciers retreat, you have primary succession. What we usually see is secondary succession. Secondary succession is in an area where there's already soil and there's already some living organisms, but there has been some sort of disturbance and it's going to go back to the way that it was. A good example of this is, say, an abandoned farm where people move in, they chop down the forest, they start to grow a crop, and let's say for some reason they abandon that and then humans leave that area. Well, then you would see secondary succession. You would see nature basically reclaiming what it once already owned. And the major difference there is the formation of soil. If you already have soil and creatures in place, it's secondary, happens a lot quicker, and there is a different series of creatures that go through that process. Primary succession takes a long time. The formation of soil, the breakdown of rock, obviously takes a long time, and you have a different series of creatures that make up primary succession. Now, in the end, you may end up with climax communities that look very similar, depending on the geographic area of the earth that you're talking about. But primary succession starts from nothing. Secondary is basically taking over what was nature's to begin with. A series of creatures that come about through succession can affect each other in different ways. Early arriving species, especially like if we're talking primary succession, we call those pioneer species like the lichens and the bacteria and the fungi that first arrive. Those early arriving species can affect the later arriving species. They may make the conditions more favorable for later arriving species, or they may actually inhibit later arriving species, or there may be kind of a neutral interaction to where they tolerate each other because they've divided the resources in different ways, or they're not in direct competition. I mentioned retreating glaciers. That's a great example of primary succession. After these retreating glaciers pull back and you're left with basically nothing but the exposed rock and material, you can watch succession happen over a period of time. So succession on the moraines in the Glacier Bay of Alaska have been followed for a number of years, and they follow a predictable pattern of change in the types of plants that live there and the types of animals that live there as well. So at first we have what we call pioneering species of plants. Liverworts, mosses, fireweed, they are what take over first. So here you have the pioneering stage where there are particular plants and lichens that come onto the scene first. You can see the glacier in the background retreating there. Second stage is by another particular type of plant, in this case called the dryas. And so in the second stage, you have other plants start to come in. Perhaps these plants couldn't survive on the bare rocky soil, but once the soil gets further broken down and there's more nutrients added, then they can come in and they can start to take over. Third stage, we start to have other plants and creatures come in. Alder invades and forms dense thickets. So we have this type of tree called an alder tree that can now come in and start to take over. And then it says alder overgrown by Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and mountain hemlock. And this would be kind of the final stages where you end up with this spruce forest. So we started off with the pioneering stages, and then we move through a series of changes of succession until we reach what we might consider a stable or climax community. Now when we say stable or climax, remember that there's always still going to be changes going on within this community, but it's not likely to go all the way back to stage one unless there's some dramatic disturbance like another ice age or something to that effect. Succession is a result of changes induced by the vegetation itself. In this case, the plants that actually live there have an effect on the environment, and they have a further effect that either allows or kind of inhibits the following creatures in the next stage. For example, on the glacial moraines, which are the rocky soil outcroppings left when the glaciers leave, that vegetation lowers the soil pH and increases soil nitrogen content. So these guys, these pioneering species, they actually change the soil to make it possible for the next successive species to come through and survive. So here are those stages compared to the amount of soil nitrogen within the soil, and you can see early on the soil nitrogen level is very low, and really only the pioneer species can come in and make it. But as the successive species go through, the soil nitrogen levels rise. So these spruce trees could not live back here at this point early on, and they are not even able to live in this area until the whole land has gone through this process. The last thing we might want to mention, of course, about disturbance is human-caused disturbance. We have been talking about forest fires, volcanic eruptions, naturally occurring disturbances. But of course, humans have the greatest impact on biological communities worldwide. We create tremendous amounts of disturbance, and usually these disturbances are of the negative variety, of the large-scale negative variety that reduce species diversity. A good example that you see in the textbook is the effects of deep-sea trawling. Deep-sea trawling is where they drag nets along the bottom of the seafloor to collect fish or shrimp or whatever we're fishing for. And you can see what it's done to the ecosystem off northwest Australia, the coral ecosystem and the like. Of course, these nets come through and they drag across the bottom of the seafloor and do horrendous damage to the coral and the ecosystems down there. And so this is kind of a before and after what you see, this reduction in diversity, this reduction in species richness and life that you see here. And this is a direct impact or direct effect of human activity and human disturbance. And of course we could go on and list hundreds of different examples of burning, chopping down, slash and burn in the various rainforests around the world, or any number of examples of paving over and reducing diversity in an area by cutting down trees and building houses and malls and the like. So humans actually do quite a bit of disturbance to the ecology and various communities, and oftentimes that's large-scale negative affecting for the population richness and diversity. We're going to take another break right there. We're next going to talk about the biogeographic factors that affect community diversity. You're going to find, of course, that community diversity is greater in some areas of the world than it is in others. And we're going to talk about why that is. That would be Concept 54.4. We'll be right back.